gotten a lot of information about, the future of healthcare exchanges and so on and so forth. But some of us here may want to go back a step before we think about, shall we get rid of this law? I mean, some people are interested in some parts of this law look pretty good. Sometimes people say they like the idea that insurance policies will have no annual or lifetime limits. Insurance companies cannot rescind your coverage. Pre-existing conditions are covered without paying higher premium. Dependents are covered under their parents' policies, married or single, until age 26. Insurance companies will have to issue coverage to anyone who requests it at any time for as long as they want that coverage. So under our PPACA, you can get sick, get coverage, and cancel your coverage when you're well. Doesn't this all sound great? However, it has to be very, very expensive. And who's going to pay for all that? And if this comes to be what our law is, how will insurance companies survive? Right now, insurance companies, we're going to have, in the future, they're going to have to compete with the state exchanges. Your employer be able to give you a choice whether he offers a plan for your private insurance, or if he's going to take a penalty for the penalties. There's so much involved in that. Some of it looks really good for our country and for certain individuals, and others it's very disturbing. I have a few video clips from Dr. Jill, who is the physician, who's going to give you a little bit of a look into what's down the road for us with PPACA.
Now, of all the healthcare plans being proposed across the country since 2009, this one, PPACA, Obamacare, our current national health care law, is the only one that decreases benefits for current Medicare recipients. The only one. One of the methods they're going to use is comparative effectiveness. Comparative effectiveness chooses a dollar figure for each year of life for any person. They multiply that dollar figure by how many years you are expected to live. If the cost of your diagnosis and treatment for a medical condition exceeds that number, then you don't get the treatment. I have a drastic example, but not uncommon apparently. In the United Kingdom, one of the doctors that I know did a part of his residency in the UK in the 1990s. He's a neurosurgeon. A woman from the United Kingdom coming into the hospital slipped, fell, hit her head. Unconscious, she clearly had a subdural, we call it, has subdural hemorrhage. So this neurosurgery resident recognizes what's happening, scoops her up, they're going to bring her in the hospital, he's shaving her head, getting her ready for surgery, emergency surgery to get this blood out of her brain so that it stops compressing her brain. This is a life-threatening emergency, can be easily taken care of. As he's shaving her head, getting her ready for surgery, the chief of neurosurgery walks up and says, "What are you doing? You have to stop that right now." "What? We have to save this woman's life." He said, "She's 66 years old." She goes to the recovery room. And he's like, "Are you kidding me? We can save this woman's life. This is easy. This is bread and butter stuff." He says, "No, she's 66 years old. She's over the age limit. She goes to recovery," and they watched her die over 3 days. This is what comparative effectiveness can do. So, other areas that they are looking to save money, decrease reimbursement to providers through accountable care organizations, and the independent payment.
Does everybody understand what she's talking about, comparative effectiveness? Okay, so she's going to now tell us how this is going to come about. Who's going to decide what these numbers are? And it's the Independent Patient Advisory Board.
Covered. Part 2 is actually 2 segments of cost. What's it going to cost us? How is this law going to be paid for? And now, so this is the second part of the cost segment. At the very end of this, we're going to find out what the biggest cost to Americans may be. So another way that this law is going to decrease healthcare costs or limit them, control them, is by decreasing reimbursement to physicians and hospitals or providers in general. And that also includes like your physical therapists, nurses, home health, things like that. So there are a lot of people that are going to be affected by this. Number one is accountable care organizations, and we'll actually cover that in a later segment when we talk about how it affects doctors directly. The other one is the Independent Payment Advisory Board. So right now, we've heard about the Dr. Fix, or the sustainable growth rate, and we'll talk about that in more depth later. And that's controlled by Congress. So Congress is supposed to decide what the reimbursement will be to physicians. According to Kathleen Sebelius, if the Congress can't get the job done, they've instituted the Independent Payment Advisory Board, IPAB. This should scare everybody. This is a 15-member panel appointed by the president, does have to be approved by the Senate. It has the power to make law. In other words, a panel of non-elected officials has the power to make decisions that will actually become law. Not just rules and regulations, but actual law, without legislative, without going through the usual legislative process. So we talked about comparative effectiveness. It sets a price on a value. It sets a price on the value of every year of your life, and if any treatment or diagnostic test exceeds that value, then you don't get it.
Discussing the IPAB board, do you have questions about that? Because that was confusing to me. This 15-member board that's going to make these decisions about the value of each day, year of our life. I looked it up several places. One of the things that the notes was that Ezekiel Emanuel, who was Ron Emanuel's brother, was one of the authors of this healthcare law, and he has, with the Department of Ethics, created a program called Complete Lives System. If you look that up, you find out that these boards are going to value your life, and from 0 to adolescence, you have a smaller amount of value. When you're in adolescence, teens, high school, through productive ages, 50 or so, you have more value. After that, your value goes way down. So the purpose of the IPAB board, as I understand it, is to cut costs. They have to look at Medicare costs, what it's costing, and they have to cut it. And they're going to cut, and this is the way that they're planning to cut that. So the next place we're going to listen to is the United States Preventive Services Task Forces, which is something else I don't think you might know about.
As Preventive Services Task Force, this is a committee of government-appointed bureaucrats, not practicing physicians. Now, they may be insurance carriers, public health officials, other government-appointed workers that serve on these task forces. So, under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, PPACA, it specifically directs the president. I know that was interesting. Why does the president really needs to get involved in this? And the Secretary of Health and Human Services, currently Kathleen Sebelius, who's a lawyer, not a physician, to develop outcome providers for any given program or medical condition. In other words, the President and the Secretary of Health and Human Services are going to take it upon themselves to develop guidelines for doctors and patients to use to diagnose and treat any given medical condition. Gosh, they must be really good. This U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, there can be all kinds of different ones set up. So depending on what the disease or the medical condition is, they'll set up a different task force for that. So in 2009, Here's an example of what the task force came up with. Mammography screening guidelines that essentially put us 15 years backwards in screening mammography. It would have decreased the number of screening mammograms by 60 to 75%. Now, this is at the same time that we have studies coming out of Sweden and Norway, as well as the US, that say that screening mammography has decreased mortality from breast cancer in women by at least 30%. Wow, how did they do that? Well, part of how they did it is they ignored these studies. They chose the studies they wanted to use, they ignored other ones, they came up with their own computer models. So this is what we can expect. Now, what's the point of decreasing screening mammography? To save money. It saves a lot of money not to do screening mammograms on women between 40 and 50, to only do them every other year between 50 and 75, and then not to do them after that. So you're going to tell a 75-year-old woman, gosh, I'm sorry, we're not going to do a mammogram on you anymore. It's just not worth it. So we know it saves lives, they just decided it doesn't save enough lives. They strike again in December 2011. U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, this is a different task force, just issued new recommendations that will eliminate the need for the prostate serum antigen, or the PSA, screening lab test for prostate cancer. Now, on the mammography one and on the prostate cancer task forces, there wasn't a single practicing physician that specialized in either of these areas. For the mammography screening, there wasn't a single radiologist like me. They didn't ask me to be on this task force. So there wasn't a single breast imager, breast surgeon, oncologist, nobody giving input. For the prostate cancer, there wasn't a single urologist. These task force guidelines will force me, as a physician, to violate my Hippocratic oath, to do no harm. And I won't do it. They tell me that I can only recommend screening for women over 50 and every other year until they're 75. I won't do it. I'm going to stick with the American Cancer Society guidelines of every year after the age of 40 until the patient decides that she doesn't want to have screening mammography done anymore. That's what's going to save lives. I won't violate my Hippocratic oath, and neither will thousands of other physicians. We're going to have to make a choice. Do we abide by the government guidelines, or do we do what we think is right for our patients? And that may cost us. We may not be able to participate in this system if we disobey their rules. That's in the law. Let's talk about